Business of Property podcast. I'm Simon, and I've been investing in property for over 20 years. And if you're an active landlord or planning your next property investment, this podcast is for you. If you've already subscribed to the Business of Property email newsletter, then you will know already that you receive every Monday morning a free weekly property market report, including information about what's happening to current asking prices as properties are appearing on the market, as well as how many are being reduced or indeed increased each week. So if that feels like something you would like to see every week, then do have a look in the show notes and click the link to subscribe to our email newsletter. Now, lots of landlords are saying that they're selling their buy-to-let properties at the moment. And one of the main sort of reasons that I'm hearing, I mean, there are others as well, but one of the main ones is because they don't feel that they are making any money anymore through their buy-to-let investments. Now, I don't think this is true for all buy-to-let properties or all buy-to-let investments. It certainly can be true for some. And I thought this week I would use the example property that I walked through last week. Do go back and have a listen if you haven't already, as an example, because it fits what I think these landlords are generally talking about sort of fairly well. It's an existing investment property. It was purchased a while ago in personal name, or a personal name, not in a company, and it has a mortgage. And I think these are sort of the key ingredients that can really help, well, encourage a buy-to-let investment not to work very well. So we're going to look through some numbers and see whether this investment property, my investment property that I talked about last week, whether it should really still be considered a going concern as a buy-to-let investment. Now, a quick aside, given these sort of characteristics that I think are relevant for the properties we're considering, we are talking about less than half of the buy-to-let homes in England. Now, that means that there are a lot of buy-to-let investment properties that just don't fall into these categories and probably just aren't affected in the same way. However, about half of the buy-to-let homes is still a lot of homes. I mean, we're talking around 2 million-ish homes. So there are a lot of homes that maybe don't work or aren't going to work as fixed rate mortgages gradually expire over the next few years. And if private buy-to-let investors decide to sell 2 million rental homes in the next few years, that's going to be a very big difference, a very big change to the buy-to-let market. And particularly sort of the rental market that renters are looking at, because there's just going to be a significantly smaller supply. And I think this has already sort of come to pass a bit over the last couple of years since interest rates have increased. And despite the fact that rents have also increased, this situation where buy-to-let properties don't work in quite the same way as they used to has led to lots of sales of buy-to-let properties, and hence a much smaller rental market for renters. Hence some of the sort of crazy situations we've seen in the last few years where you can have tens, maybe even 100 plus people trying to apply for a single buy-to-let property. Whereas a decade or so ago, you'd be looking at putting a rental property up for rent and expecting it to take a few weeks to find the right tenants for that property, rather than now putting it up and having too many inquiries to deal with within a few hours. So it's a very different rental market. And I think it's going to, if this trend continues, which I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, I think it is going to continue to get harder for renters as the pool of buy-to-let properties reduces. And I don't think it's going to suddenly halve overnight or anything, but this is going to be a gradual thing over the next few years. So if you want to hear more about the property that I'm using in the examples and the numbers today, do go back and listen to the episode from last week. Today, I'm not going to re-describe the property or re-describe sort of how it came about or anything else. I am going to sort of recap some of the critical numbers, though. So the purchase was about 7 years ago, and the purchase amount was £312,000. At that time, due to limited loan to values and some fees and whatever else, the mortgage was about 207,000, just a bit under that, but around. I think I said last week it was around 205,000, so it's in that ballpark. And at that point, the interest rate for that mortgage was 1.8%. So that's just laughably low given the current interest rates you'd be looking at. But that resulted in an annual interest cost of about £3,700. And at the time the property was purchased, the annual rent was just over £16,000. So allowing for some sort of standard expense rates, 2,500-ish. I haven't used the specific numbers. If you want to hear sort of the real expense numbers and the real sort of costs involved in the first year of buying and renting this property, again, go back and listen to last week. But for this example today, I'm just using simple rounded numbers. This meant that there was a pre-interest, so before subtracting the cost of the interest, profit of 13,700, about 13,800 actually. But then once you subtract the cost of the interest, we're looking at just over £10,000 of profit per year. And that works out, given that the purchase price and mortgage and stamp duty and whatever else resulted in an investment cost of about 130,000, just under, works out an ROI of over 7.5%. So that's I think is pretty healthy by anyone's measure, and that's higher than the ROI I talked about last week because I'm using much simplified numbers and I'm not allowing for a void period that did actually exist in the real first year of this property. This is a sort of modelled, idealistic sort of year of that property. So, as I mentioned, that was 7 years ago. So, if we fast forward now to today and consider how a remortgage might look. So, if we're remortgaging now, middle of 2024, hopefully these numbers are realistic-ish. I have simplified some things, but hopefully they're not too bad. So I am assuming that I'm keeping the same mortgage, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. But assuming we've got the same mortgage of about or just over £206,000, but now we're going to be talking about an interest rate of 6% perhaps, and I'm going to go with that. I know there might be slightly lower rates available, but we'll go with 6% for the moment, and that results in interest costs annually now of over £12,000, about £12,400 in fact. And we are looking at an increased rent as well, because we're now 7 years on from that old rent, and the monthly rent has gone up. So we're now looking at rental income of nearly £22,000 a year as well. So it has increased, but not quite to the same degree. Our expected expenses have also increased, a bit over £3,000. This results in a pre-interest profit of 18 and a bit £1,000. So pretty good. That's okay. But then once you subtract the interest, we're then down to under £6,000 of profit. Okay, that's still not too bad, really. And indeed, because our investment hasn't changed, our return on investment is now a bit over 4.5%. So, okay, you could probably get about that in a savings account at the moment. Maybe slightly higher, but that's not too horrendous. However, given that we haven't paid tax on this yet, and if you put that into a savings account or an ISA, perhaps you might not be paying any tax in an ISA, but certainly even in a savings account, you'd be paying just your standard sort of percentage of tax, whatever that might be, say 40%. I'm just going to use that as an example in this scenario. However, because we now have Section 24 changing the tax calculation when we're dealing with rental properties and interest payments on those rental properties, I'm not going to dig into the calculations or anything like that today. You're just going to have to take my word for these numbers I'm going to give you. But my calculations suggest that that means that after tax, we're now looking at only having about £1,150 of profit remaining. So you can see that going from just under 6,000 to just over 1,000 is not a 40% tax rate. That is much, much higher than that. And it reduces our return on investment after tax to only about 1%. And now suddenly we're thinking, well, hang on, I can get much better than that in a savings account. However, it can get even worse. So that situation was assuming that we're getting current market rent and that we hadn't extended the mortgage over the last 7 years while we've had the property. But I think a much more likely scenario is that if you've got a tenant that's been in there for a few years, you've probably let the rent fall behind slightly, at least, maybe a lot, depending on how well you keep up to date with rent adjustments for your tenants. But also, over that time, you may well have been growing your portfolio, and you may well have used some of the capital gains within your existing portfolio to do that. So there's a good chance that when you last remortgaged this property, you were actually extending your borrowing. So I've put together another set of figures where I've assumed a slight extension to the borrowing, not crazy. The property has gone up in value quite a lot, and we're looking at having taken out an extra £75,000. So we've now got a mortgage of £260,000 instead of £206-ish thousand. So we're now having to remortgage with a higher value of mortgage, a higher cost that we have borrowed, a higher amount that we have borrowed. And we're no longer expecting to get quite the market rent, because the previous calculation I went through was about £21,600 of annual rent. That was at sort of market rate for this property. But if we've let it slip a little bit, we've increased it a bit from where it started, but we've only done that a bit rather than really keeping up with inflation and keeping up with the market rent. So now we're looking at only £19,200 of annual rent. So we feed these two sort of key changes into the calculations, and we are now looking at quite a different end result. So we've still got the same 6% interest rate on the mortgage, and it means that now we're looking at a pre-interest profit figure of only just over 16,000. Okay, that's still not too horrendous. But the interest that we're paying has gone up from 12 and a bit thousand now to 15,500 a year because of that extra borrowing and paying the extra interest on that extra borrowing. And that means that now our post-interest profit, so the profit we've got left after we've subtracted the actual cost of the interest that we're paying out, is only £700. So that's very, very low now. And then we've got Section 24 to allow for and tax. So just before I get onto that, actually, the £700 is about 0.5% return on investment. So not looking terribly pretty already. But then once we take off the effects of Section 24, and again, you can have to take my word for these calculations, but it actually means that once we've paid tax, we've made a loss on this property of over £2,500 in the year. So we would have actually had to pay to rent out this property after tax. So you wouldn't see this through the year, every month. I mean, you would see that there wasn't much in the way of margin left every month, but you wouldn't see that you're actually making a loss until at the end of the year you came to do your tax return, and then you found that your tax bill was more than the profit you had left from renting out this property. And you'd then be running at a negative 1.8 or 1.9% return on investment, losing money on this investment. I do think that buy-to-let investments can still work in the right situation, especially if you're starting with the knowledge of the world as it currently is. But I also understand why a lot of existing landlords are looking at their existing portfolio and they're doing these calculations that I've done today, and they are quite rightly concluding that these properties are not working for them. And if landlords are not doing these calculations in advance, especially where they're kind of on the border, so as in they are making a little bit of profit month to month, but they haven't allowed for that Section 24 effect at the end of the year when the tax return comes in, they are going to get a sudden shock at that point, and there is going to be a lot of landlords then concluding that these things are not going to work for them, and their properties just don't work. Now, it is true that these properties will have experienced capital gains, and hopefully they will continue to experience capital gains in the future, and perhaps that would offset the sort of month-to-month losses or year-to-year losses, seeing as the tax isn't seen every month. And maybe it would still make sense to keep these properties and keep renting them out. But I think that's a very difficult decision to actually make when you can't tell the future of capital gains, you can't see what's going to happen to the property market, and you are faced with just making the decision for currently, and you can see that you could sell that property, take the capital that you've got in it, the equity from that sale, put it in a savings account, and make more money, make significantly more money. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult to convince landlords in this situation to hold on to their rental properties and to continue providing rental homes for tenants when it just doesn't really work financially. So I do talk to the landlords who are in this situation from time to time as I'm talking to people at events and other situations where I have chats with landlords, and it is always very interesting to sort of see what people are doing. And I think quite a common situation I'm seeing at the moment is quite a lot of landlords know they're in this situation, and they're actually currently living through an even worse situation where fixed rates have expired. They're not remortgaging because they've actually got the property on the market to sell, and they are currently paying standard variable rates, which rather than being 6%, they're up at sort of 8 or even 9% in some cases. So it's that in those situations, landlords are really feeling that their buy-to-let investments just do not work at all. So I think it's a difficult world for older buy-to-let property investors, especially ones who have been really trying to grow over the last decade or so, and they've been taking advantage of increasing equity and remortgaging and pulling money out to put it into new properties to keep the ball rolling in growing their portfolio, especially if they've been doing it in personal names. I think that's the sort of two things in combination are really where the problem gets especially bad. I hope this slightly shorter episode and this fairly rapid dive through some fairly complex numbers have been interesting for you today, and not, I hope that some of you are still listening. That hasn't put you off too much. I would be very keen to hear your own personal situations. Are any of you in this situation? Are you concluding that your buy-to-let properties just don't work? And if you are selling buy-to-let properties that you've owned in your personal name and things like that, what are you choosing to do with that released equity? Are you putting it back into other properties, perhaps other buy-to-lets bought in other ways, or some other kind of property investment, perhaps HMOs or something else like that. I'd be very interested to hear those situations and those stories. So please do let me know. You can reach me on show@thebusinessofproperty.com, and I will look forward to speaking to you again next time.